Alright, I'm back. I think we're a good, third through the book, or fourth. Anyway, I'm just gonna get right into it. Get comfortable. I've set it up a little bit more comfortable here so I don't have to hold the weight of the entire book in my hand. Let's see how well it works. Alright. Rules of the game. 1887 to 1889. Sorry. There are fewer circus dinners now that the circus itself is up and running properly, gaining its self-sufficiency, as Chandrash phrased it at one dinner not long after opening night. The original conspirators still gather for dinner occasionally, particularly when the circus is performing nearby, but this has become more and more infrequent. Mr. A.H. does not appear, despite his standing invitation. And as these meetings were the only opportunity Marco was given to see his instructor, the continued absence frustrates him. After a year without a sign, without any word or a single glimpse of the gray top hat, Marco decides to call on him. He does not know his instructor's current residence. He assumes, rightly, that it is likely a temporary place, and by the time he tracked down the proper location, his instructor would have moved to a new, equally temporary residence. Instead, Marco carves a series of symbols into the frost on the window of his flat that faces out to the street, using the columns of the museum beyond as a guide. Most of the symbols are indistinguishable unless the light hits them at precise angles, but they are collectively set into the shape of a large A. Oh. The next day, there's a knock at the door. As always, the man in the gray suit refuses to enter the flat. He only stands in the hall and fixes Marco with a cool gray stare. "What is it that you want?" he asks. "I would like to know if I'm doing well," Marco says. His instructor looks at him for a moment, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "Your work has been sufficient," he says. "Is this how the challenge is going to proceed?" Marco asks. "Each of us manipulating the circus? How long will it go on?" "You have been given a venue to work within," his instructor says. "You present your skills to the best of your ability, and your opponent does the same. You do not interfere with each other's work. It shall continue in this matter until there's a victor. It is not that complex." That doesn't make any sense. "I'm not certain I understand the rules," Marco says. "You don't need to understand the rules. You need to follow them. As I said, your work has been sufficient." He starts to leave, but then hesitates. "Do not do that again," he says, pointing over Marco's shoulder at the frost-covered window. Then he turns and walks away. The symbols on the window melt into meaningless streaks. It is the middle of the day, and the circus sleeps quietly, but Celia Bowen stands in front of the carousel, watching as black and white and silver creatures file past, suspended on coordinating ribbons, riderless. "I don't like this thing," a voice behind her says. Hector Bowen is no more than an apparition in the dimly lit tent. His dark suit vanishes into the shadows. The shifting light catches and releases the brightness of his shirt, the gray of his hair, illuminating the disapproving glare on his face as he watches the carousel over his daughter's shoulder. "Why ever not?" Celia responds without turning. "It's extremely popular, and it was a great deal of work. That should count for something, Papa." His derisive scoff is only an echo of what it once was, and Celia is relieved that he cannot see her smile at the softness of the sound. Yes, get him. "You would not be so reckless were I not." His voice trails off with a wave of a transparent hand next to her arm. "Don't be cross with me about that," Celia says. "You did it to yourself. It's not my fault you can't undo it. And I'm hardly being reckless." "How much did you tell this architect of yours?" her father asks. "I told him as much as I thought he needed to know," Celia says as he drifts past her, moving to inspect the carousel. "He's fond of pushing boundaries, and I offered to help him push them further. Isn't Mr. Barris my opponent? Is Mr. Barris my opponent? That would be quite devious of him, building me a carousel to avoid suspicion." "He's not your opponent," Hector says with a dismissive gesture, the lace cuff of his shirt fluttering like a moth. "Though such a thing would very well be considered cheating." How is utilizing an engineer to execute an idea not working within the venue, Papa?" "I discussed it with him. He handled the design and construction, and I embellished it. Would you like to ride it? It goes quite a bit farther than around and around." "Oh man, I want to ride it. Oh my god." "Obviously," Hector says, looking down at the darkened tunnel that the line of creatures disappears into. "I still don't like it." Celia sighs, walking to the edge of the carousel to pet the head of an oversized raven as it passes by. There are already countless elements in this circus that are collaborative, she says. Why can I not use that to my advantage? You keep insisting I have to do more than just my performances, but I need to create opportunities in order to manage that. Mr. Barris is quite helpful in that capacity. Working with others will only drag you down. These people are not your friends. They are inconsequential, and one of them is your opponent. Don't forget that. Stop being such a wet blanket. You know who it is, don't you? Celia asks. I have my suspicions, but you won't tell me what those are. The identity of your opponent does not matter. It matters to me. Hector frowns, watching as she absently toys with the ring on her right hand. It shouldn't, he says. But my opponent knows who I am, yes? Indeed, unless your opponent happens to be profoundly stupid. And it is unlike Alexander to choose a profoundly stupid student. But it does not matter. It is better for you to do your own work without influence from your opponent and without any of this collaborating, as you call it. He waves an arm at the carousel and the ribbons shudder as though the softest of breezes has wandered into the tent. How is it better? Celia asks. How is anything better than anything else here? How is one tent comparable to another? How can any of this possibly be judged? It's very good questions. That is not your concern. How can I excel at a game when you refuse to tell me the rules? The suspended creatures turn their heads in the direction of the ghost in their midst. Griffins and foxes and wyverns? Oh god, I don't know how to say that word. I've never said it out loud. Wyverns? Wyverns? Fuck. They all stare at him with glossy black eyes. Stop that! Hector snaps at his daughter. The creatures return to their forward-facing gazes, but one of the wolves growls as it settles back into its frozen state. I love her. You are not taking this as seriously as you should. It's a circus, Celia says. It's difficult to take it seriously. The circus is only a venue. Then this is not a game or a challenge. It's an exhibition. It's more than that. How? Celia demands, but her father only shakes his head. I have told you all the rules you need to know. You push the bounds of what your skills can do using the circus as a showplace. You prove yourself better and stronger. You do everything you can to outshine your opponent. And when do you determine which of us is shinier? I do not determine anything, Hector says. Stop asking questions, do more, and stop collaborating. Before she can respond, he vanishes, leaving her standing alone in the sparkling light from the carousel. At first, the letters Marco receives from Isabel arrive frequently, but as the circus travels to far-flung cities and countries, weeks and sometimes months stretch wordlessly between each missive. When a new letter finally arrives, he does not even take off his coat before ripping open the envelope. He skims the opening pages that are filled with polite inquiries into his own days in London, remarks about how she misses the city, misses him. The goings-on of the circus are dutifully reported, but with such matter-of-fact precision that he cannot picture it in the richness of detail that he desires. She glazes over things she considers mundane, the traveling in the train, though Marco is certain they cannot be moving solely by train. The distance of the circus feels more pronounced despite the tenuous contact through ink and paper. There is so little about her. Isabel does not even inscribe her name upon the pages, referring to her in passing only as the illusionist, a precaution he advised himself and now regrets. He wants to know everything about her, how she spends her time when not performing, how she interacts with her audiences, how she takes her tea. He cannot bring himself to ask Isabel these things. When he writes her in return, he requests that she continue to write as often as possible. He emphasizes how much her letters mean to him. He takes the pages inscribed with her handwriting, descriptions of striped tents and star-speckled skies, and folds them into birds, letting them fly across the empty flat. Aww. Oh my gosh, this is another one of my little bookmarks. One of my favorite passages. It is so rare to have a new tent appear that Celia considers canceling her performances entirely in order to spend the evening investigating it. Instead, she waits, executing her standard number of shows, finishing the last a few hours before dawn. Only then does she navigate her way through nearly empty pathways to find the latest addition to the circus. The sign proclaims something called the Ice Garden, and Celia smiles at the addendum below, which contains an apology for any thermal inconvenience. Despite the name, she is not prepared for what awaits her inside the tent. It is exactly what the sign described, but it is so much more than that. There are no stripes visible on the walls. Everything is sparkling and white. She cannot tell how far it stretches, the size of the tent obscured by cascading willows and twisting vines. The air itself is magical, crisp and sweet in her lungs as she breathes, sending a shiver down to her toes that is caused by more than the forewarned drop in temperature. There are no patrons in the tent as she explores, circling alone around trellises covered in pale roses and a softly bubbling, elaborately carved fountain, and everything, save for the occasional lengths of white silk ribbons strung like garlands, is made of ice. Curious, Celia picks a frosted peony from its branch, the stem breaking easily, but the layered petals shatter, falling from her fingers to the ground, disappearing in the blades of ivory grass below. When she looks back at the branch, an identical bloom has already appeared. Celia cannot imagine how much power and skill it would take not only to construct such a thing, but to maintain it as well. And she longs to know how her opponent came up with the idea, aware that every perfectly structured topiary, every detail down to the stones that line the paths like pearls, must have been planned. It would be so taxing to manage something similar, she feels fatigued even considering it. She almost wishes her father were here. She almost wishes her father were there, as she is beginning to understand why he had always been so adamant about building up her strength and control, though she is not entirely certain she wants to thank him for it. And she likes having the space to herself, the stillness and the calm sweetened by the subdued scent of rose and flowers. Celia remains in the ice garden long after the sun rises outside and the gates have been closed for the day. Watch me just not have more water in here. I feel like I've got something stuck in my throat. I really hope I'm not getting sick. Alright. The circus arrives... I'm going to try that again. The circus arrives near London for the first visit in some time, and the afternoon before it opens there's a knock on the door of Marco's flat. He opens the door only part way, holding it in place when he finds Isabel in the hallway. "You changed your locks," she said. "Why did you not let me know you were coming?" Marco asks. "I thought you might like the surprise," Isabel says. Marco refuses to let her enter the flat, but he leaves her waiting in the hall only for a few moments before returning, bowler hat in hand. The afternoon is crisp but bright, and he takes her to tea. "What is that?" Marco asks, glancing down at Isabel's wrist as they walk. "Nothing," she says, pulling the cuff of her sleeve down to obscure his view of the bracelet, a carefully woven braid of her hair entwined with his. He does not inquire further. Though Isabel never takes the bracelet off, it is gone when she returns to the circus that evening, vanished from her skin as though it had never been there. Oh, poor Isabel. I think she can tell that he's already someone else's. Tasting. Lyon, September 1889. Herr Friedrich Thiessen is on holiday in France. He often goes on holiday in France in the autumn, as he's a great lover of wine. He picks a region and roams the countryside for a week, or perhaps two, visiting vineyards and collecting bottles of pleasing vintage to be shipped back to Munich. Oh my god, that sounds like so much fun. Herr Thiessen is friendly with several French winemakers and has made clocks for many of them. He visits one such winemaker on this particular trip to pay his respects and sample the latest bottles. Over a glass of Burgundy, the winemaker suggests that Friedrich might enjoy the circus that is in town, set up in a field a few miles away. Oh my god, I'm so excited! A rather unusual circus, only open at night. But it is the clock, and the elaborate black and white clock situated just inside the gates that the winemaker thinks might particularly interest Herr Thiessen. "Reminds me of your work," the winemaker says, gesturing with his glass to the clock on the wall above the bar, shaped like a cascading bunch of grapes that tumble into a wine bottle that fills with wine as the hands on its label, an exact replica of the vineyard's label, tick by the seconds. That's amazing! This man is magic. Nobody could create a clock like that without magic. I mean, I know this is fantasy, but like... Anyway, Herr Thiessen is intrigued, and after an early dinner, he puts on his hat and gloves and begins walking in the general direction his winemaker friend had indicated. It's not difficult to locate his destination, as several townspeople are walking in the same direction, and once they pass out of town and into the fields, the circus cannot be missed. It glows. That is Herr Friedrich Thiessen's first impression of Le Cirque de Rêve, seen from half a mile away before he even knows its name. He walks towards it on a chilly evening through the French countryside like a moth to a flame. Oh my god! There is a considerable crowd outside when Herr Thiessen finally reaches the gates, and despite the crowd, he would have spotted his clock instantly, even without having been informed of its placement. It looms across from the ticket booth just inside the large iron gates. It is about to strike 7 o'clock, and he stands back to watch it, letting the line for tickets pass in front of him as the Harlequin juggler pulls out a 7th ball from thin air, as the dragon's tail twitches, and the clock chimes 7 quiet chimes, barely audible over the din of the circus. Oh, I found a typo. Oops. It says tail with an E instead of an I. Herr Thiessen is pleased. The clock appears to be in perfect working order and has obviously been well taken care of, despite being left out in the elements. He wonders if it might need a stronger varnish and wishes he had been informed that it would be used out of doors when he was constructing it, though it looks none the worse for the wear. He keeps his eyes on it as he waits in line, wondering if he should try to contact Mr. Barris about the matter, if he still has the London address in his files back in Munich. When it is his turn, he gives the posted amount of francs to the ticket seller, a young woman in a black dress and long white gloves, looking more prepared for an elegant evening at the opera than for a night selling tickets at the circus. As she pulls out a ticket, he inquires, first in French and then in English, when she does not catch his meaning, if she might know whom he could contact about the clock. She does not reply, but her eyes light up when he identifies himself as the person responsible for its construction. She returns his francs with his ticket despite his protestations, and after rummaging through a small box, produces a business card, which she hands to him as well. Herr Thiessen thanks her, moving out of line and off to the side, inspecting the card. It is a high-quality card on heavy stock, a black background embossed with silver. Le Cirque des Rêves, Chandras Christophe Lefebvre, proprietor. The back has an address in London. Herr Thiessen places it in his coat pocket along with his ticket and his saved francs, and takes his first steps into the circus. He begins by simply wandering, casually investigating the odd home of his Wunschtraum clock. I still haven't looked up what that means. I keep forgetting. Maybe wonder or something? I don't know many German words. I know like star, snail. Anyway, perhaps because of the months he spent absorbed in working on the clock itself, the circus feels familiar, comfortable. Oh man. The monochromatic color scheme, the endless circles of the pathway like clockworks. Herr Thiessen is amazed at how well his clock fits the circus and how well the circus fits the clock. Oh man, I'm tearing up again. Okay. He enters only a fraction of the tents that first night, stopping to watch fire breathers and sword dancers, sampling a very fine ice vine in a tent marked Drinkery, mature visitors only. When he inquires about it, the bartender, the only person in the circus that Friedrich encounters who speaks when spoken to, albeit minimally, informs him that it is a Canadian wine and notes the vintage for him. Oh. By the time Herr Thiessen departs the circus, motivated solely by exhaustion, he is completely and utterly besotted. I completely understand. Oh man. If there was a circus like this in real life, I would spend all of my fucking money following this circus. I would not regret it. Oh god. Alright. He attends twice more before returning to Munich, paying his admission in full both times. He writes a letter to Monsieur. There's just an M with a period, and I never really know what to say when it does that. M. Lefebvre upon his return, to thank him for giving his clock such a wondrous home and for the experience of the circus itself. He goes on at length about the mastery of it and says he gathered there is no rhyme or reason to its itinerary, but expresses his hope that it'll come to Germany. Oh! Some weeks later, he receives a letter from Lefebvre's assistant, stating that Lefebvre greatly appreciates Herr Thiessen's compliments, especially coming from such a talented artist. The letter speaks highly of the clock and mentions that there should be any kind of problem with it, Herr Thiessen will be contacted immediately. The letter mentions nothing of the current location of the circus or anything about it coming to Germany, much to Herr Thiessen's disappointment. He thinks about the circus frequently, often as he works, and it begins to have an influence upon his work. Many of his new clocks are done in black and white, some with stripes, and many with scenes from the circus, tiny acrobats, miniature snow leopards, a fortune teller who lays out minuscule tarot cards on the hour. Oh man, that's beautiful. Though he fears he never does the circus justice in these clockwork tributes. Chaperoned. Ooh, Cairo. Cairo, November 1890. While the Murray twins are more or less allowed to run rampant around the hidden corners of what is often referred to as backstage, a sprawling mansion's worth of space dispersed into nooks and passageways where the occupants of the circus live their lives when they are not performing. If they wish to be out and about in the circus proper during performance hours, they must have a chaperone. They protest this rule loudly and often, but their father insists that these rules will stay in place until they are 8 years old, at the very least. Widget asks often if the 8 years counts if it is a combined total, in which case they already meet the criteria. I love these children so much. They are repeatedly reminded they must have some sort of structure to their nocturnal schedule, being the only children in a rather unconventional household. It takes a circus to raise a child, right? Dude, I'd fucking love to be raised in a circus. That would be amazing. All the languages, all the cultures, all the people. Especially in this kind of circus. Because that means I would be able to see all the tents. Okay. For now, they have a rotating company of chaperones, and tonight the illusionist is on twin supervising duty. She's not often assigned this role, although the twins are quite fond of her. But this evening, she has enough time to spare between performances to escort them for a while. None of the patrons recognize Celia without her top hat and black and white gown, even those who watched her perform earlier in the evening. If passerby pay her any notice, it's only to wonder how the children at her heels ended up with such red hair when her own is so dark. Beyond that, she appears to be just a young woman in a blue coat, wandering the circus as any other patron might. They start in the ice garden, though the twins grow impatient with the leisurely pace that Celia prefers to take around the frozen trees. Before they have traveled halfway through the space, they are begging to ride the carousel instead. They argue over who will get to ride the griffin, but Widget relents when Celia tells them the story of the 9-tailed fox just behind it, which suddenly sounds much more appealing. Oh, they sound like such cute children. As soon as they disembark, a second ride is requested. For the subsequent trip through the loops of silver clockwork and tunnels, they end up on a serpent and a rabbit with no complaints to be heard. After the carousel rides, Widget wants something to eat, so they head for the courtyard. When Celia procures him a black and white striped bag of popcorn, he insists he wants caramel as well, and will not eat it plain. The vendor, dipping apples on sticks into dark, sticky caramel, obliges him, drizzling it over the top. Several patrons nearby request the same. Poppet claims she isn't hungry. She seems distracted, so as they walk down a quieter passageway away from the courtyard, Celia asks if anything is bothering her. "I don't want the nice lady to die," Poppet says, tugging gently at Celia's skirt. Celia stops walking, putting a hand out to keep Widget, who is oblivious to anything other than his popcorn, from continuing along in front of her. "What do you mean, dearest?" she asks Poppet. "They're going to put her in the ground," Poppet exclaims. "I think that's sad." "What nice lady?" Celia asks. Poppet scrunches up her face while she thinks. "I don't know," she says. They look the same." "Poppet's sweetheart?" Celia says, pulling the twins aside into an alcove and bending down to talk to her face to face. "Where is this lady in the ground? Where did you see her, I mean?" "In the stars," Poppet says. She stands on tiptoe as she points upward. Celia glances up at that star-filled sky, watching the moon disappear behind a cloud before returning her attention to Poppet. "Do you often see things in the stars?" she asks. "Only sometimes," Poppet says. "Widget sees things on people." Celia turns to Widget, who is eating his caramel-drizzled popcorn in messy handfuls. "Same." "You see things on people?" she asks him. "Sometimes," he mumbles through a mouthful. "What kind of things?" Celia asks. Widget shrugs his shoulders. "Places they've been," he says. "Stuff they've done." He shoves another handful of sticky popcorn into his mouth. "Interesting," Celia says. The twins have told her a great many odd things before, but this seems more than childish fancies. "Can you see something on me? Can you see anything on me?" she asks Widget. Widget squints at her while he chews on his popcorn. "Rooms that smell like powder and old clothes," he says. "A lady that cries all the time. A ghost man with a frilly shirt that follows you around and—" Widget stops suddenly, frowning. "You made it go away," he said. "There's nothing there anymore. How did you do that?" "Some things are not for you to see," Celia says. Widget pushes his lower lip out in an impressive pout, but it only lasts as long as it takes him to bring another fistful of popcorn to his mouth. Celia looks from the twins back in the direction of the courtyard, where the light from the bonfire gleams along the edges of the tents, casting dancing shadows of patrons across the striped fabric. The bonfire never goes out. The flames never falter. Even when the circus moves, it is not extinguished, moving intact from location to location, smoldering the entire length of each train journey, safely contained in its iron cauldron. It has burned steadily since the ceremonious lighting on opening night, and at the same moment, Celia remains certain something was put in motion that impacted the entire circus and everyone within it once that fire was lit, including the newborn twins. Widget born just before midnight at the end of an old day, Poppet following moments later, and the new day only just begun. Poppet, Celia says, turning her attention back to the little girl who's been playing with the cuff of her jacket. If you see things in the stars that you think might be important, I want you to tell me about them. Do you understand? Poppet nods solemnly, clouds of red hair bobbing in waves. She leans in to ask Celia a question, her eyes dreadfully serious. May I have a caramel apple? She asks. I'm out of popcorn, Widget complains, holding out his empty bag. Celia takes the bag from him and folds it up into ever smaller squares while the twins watch until it disappears completely. When they clap, Widget's hands are no longer covered in caramel, though he does not notice. Celia considers the twins for a moment, while Widget tries to figure out where the popcorn bag is gone, and Poppet casts thoughtful glances up at the sky. It is not a good idea. She knows it's not a good idea, but it would be better to keep them close, to watch them more carefully given the circus's given the circumstances and their apparent talents. Would the two of you like to learn how to do things like that? Celia asks him. Widget nods immediately with such enthusiasm that his hat slips forward over his eyes. Poppet hesitates, but then she nods as well. Then, when you're a little older, I shall give you lessons, but it will have to be our secret, Celia says. Can you two keep a secret? The twins nod in unison. Widget has to straighten his hat again. They follow Celia happily as she leads them back into the courtyard. All right. Wishes and Desires. Paris, May 1891. When the beaded curtain parts with a sound like rain, it is Marco who enters the fortune teller's chamber, and Isabel immediately flips her veil from her face, the impossibly thin black silk floating back over her head like mist. What are you doing here? She asks. Why didn't you tell me about this? Ignoring her question, he holds out an open notebook, and in the flickering light, Isabel can discern a bare black tree. It is not like the trees that are inscribed in so many of his books. This one is covered in dripping white candles. Surrounding the main drawings are detailed sketches of twisted branches, capturing several different angles. That's the wishing tree, Isabel says. It's new. I know it's new, Marco says. Why didn't you tell me about it? I haven't had time to write to you, Isabel says, and I wasn't even sure whether or not it was something you had done yourself. It seemed like something you might have made. It's lovely the way the wishes are added to it by lighting candles with ones that are already lit and adding them to the branches. New wishes ignited by old wishes. It's hers, Marco says simply, pulling the notebook back. How can you be certain? Isabel asks. Marco pauses, looking down at the sketch, annoyed that he could not properly capture the beauty of the thing and hastily render drawings. I can feel it, he says. It's like knowing a storm is coming and the shift in the air around it. As soon as I walked into the tent, I could sense it, and it is stronger, closer to the tree itself. I'm not certain it would be perceptible if one were unfamiliar with such sensation. Do you think she can feel what you do in the same way? Isabel asks. Marco has not considered this before, though it seems it would be true. He finds the idea strangely pleasing. I do not know, is all he says to Isabel. Isabel pushes the veil that is slipping over her face back behind her head again. Well, she says, now you know about it and you can do whatever you want to it. It doesn't work that way, Marco says. I cannot use anything she does for my own purposes. The sides need to remain separate. If we were playing a game of chess, I could not simply remove her pieces from the board. My only option is to retaliate with my own pieces when she moves hers. But there can't possibly be an end game then, Isabel says. How can you checkmate a circus? It doesn't make any sense. It's not like chess, Marco says, struggling to explain something that he has finally begun to understand, even though he cannot properly articulate it. He glances at her table, where a few cards remain laid face up, one in particular catching his attention. It's like this, he says, pointing at the woman with her scales and sword, La Justice, inscribed below her feet. It's a set of scales. One side is mine, one side is hers. The set of silver scales appears on the table between the cards, balancing precariously, each side piled with diamonds that sparkle in the candlelight. So the object is to tip the scales in your favor, Isabel asks. Marco nods, turning through the pages of his notebook. He keeps flipping back to the page with the tree. But if you both keep adding to your sides of the scale, increasing the weight on each side in turn, Isabel says, watching the gently swaying scale, won't it break? I do not believe it is an exact comparison, Marco says, and the scales vanish. I think that's actually a really good metaphor for it. Isabel frowns at the empty space. How long is this going to go on? She asks. I have no idea, Marco says. Do you want to leave? He adds, looking up at her, unsure of what response he wants to the question. No, Isabel says, I don't want to leave. I like it here, I do, but I would also like to understand. Maybe if I understood better, I could be more helpful. You are helpful, Marco says. Perhaps the only advantage I have is that she does not know who I am. She only has a circus to react to, and I have you to watch her. But I haven't seen any reaction, Isabel protests. She keeps to herself. She reads more than anyone I have ever met. The Murray twins adore her. She has been nothing but kind to me. I have never seen her do a single thing out of the ordinary beyond when she performs. You say she's making all these moves, and yet I never see her do anything. How do you know that tree is not Ethan Barris's work? Mr. Barris creates impressive mechanics, but this is not his doing. Though she's embellished his carousel, I'm certain of that. I doubt even an engineer of Mr. Barris's talent can make a painted wooden griffin breathe. That tree is rooted in the ground. It is a living tree, even if it does not have leaves. Marco turns his attention back to his sketch, tracing the lines of the tree with his fingertip. Did you make a wish? Isabel asks quietly. Marco closes his notebook without answering the question. Does she still perform on the quarter hour? He asks, drawing a watch from his pocket. Yes, but you're going to sit there and watch her show? Isabel asks. There's barely room for 20 people in that tent. She'll notice you. Won't she think it's strange that you're here? She won't even recognize me, Marco says. The watch vanishes from his hand. Whenever there's a new tent, I would appreciate it if you would let me know. He turns and walks away, moving so quickly that the candle flames shiver with the motion of the air. I miss you, Isabel says as he leaves. The sentiment is crushed by the clatter of the beaded curtain falling close behind him. She tugs the black mist of her veil back down over her face. After the last of her querents has departed in the early hours of the morning, Isabel takes her Marseille deck from her pocket. She carries it with her always, although she has a separate deck for circus readings, a custom-made version in black and white and shades of gray. From the Marseille deck, she draws a single card. She knows which it will be before she turns it over. The angel emblazoned on the front is only a confirmation of what she already suspects. She does not return it to the deck. I feel so bad for Isabel. Like most of the other people, just caught up in something bigger than her and bigger than what she can understand. Just because two old white men are having an argument. I can't blame Marco, but I also can a little bit. Like, boy, can't you tell she's in love with you? Like, I know you're preoccupied with all this stuff. I mean, yeah. I guess it's easier for me to see on the outside how, casually unkind he's being to her just because he doesn't notice. Also because I think I've done that before on accident. Next time. I mean, until next time.